Right, so if you're visiting with us, the focus of the series that we're looking at is called Fundamentals of the Faith. We're doing basically a time of teaching, walking through the Apostles' Creed. And in some ways, one of the things that you'll see as we go through this series is that there's really kind of a logical progression. The Apostles' Creed, as we saw that a few weeks ago, it's made up of 12 different statements, what we call 12 different articles of the Christian faith. And really, as you walk through them, they kind of one leads into the next. And that's true as we kind of start this message today. Last week, we looked at the opening statement, which is, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. And we kind of talked about the fact that on the one hand, that's a picture of a powerful God that we're declaring, that there's a God who has created all things. But on the other hand, we're also saying that that's a very personal God. Right, because that God, we're declaring that He's my God, that He's my Father, that I know Him in an intimate, personal relationship. And so the question kind of that flows from that first statement is, how does that work? Right? How does God become your Father? How do you become His child? What does that involve? And the answer, obviously, is through His Son, Jesus Christ. And this is something that you discover in the Gospel of John. As John opens up his gospel, he really holds out Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son, as the way that we become children of God. And so I thought I'd begin, and I'm going to spend some time reflecting on the Gospel of John. I'm going to read the first 18 verses. Some of the stuff that I'm going to cover today is perhaps a bit more technical. Yes, we're going to talk about a little bit of Greek language, which I know you love. That's why I share it with you. I saw some of you roll your eyes, but we'll get there. So I want to start a bit technical, but I want to build out from that also on why it matters. So let's start with the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son, from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.' For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." Now, I'm assuming that for many of you, there's probably been a point in your life where you've had Jehovah's Witnesses knock on your door. I'm assuming that at some point that's probably happened. I think it's fair to say for most of us. And if you engage in a conversation with Jehovah's Witnesses, and particularly if you kind of get into their views and your views and you debate a bit of theology, it's very likely that at some point John chapter 1 is going to come up. And the reason why is because their translation of John chapter 1 has some significant differences as compared to the translations that you're going to find in most of your English Bibles. And these differences have a pretty significant impact on how we actually view Jesus Christ. And so I'm going to start by just highlighting some. I have 3 on the screen here that this is from the New World Translation, which is a translation that's used exclusively by the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so in John chapter 1, this is a passage you're probably fairly familiar with. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. This is obviously one of the differences that stand out. And then there's two things I'm going to focus on in particular. They all kind of connect together, but John 1:14. So the Word became flesh and resided among us, and we had a view of his glory, a glory as such belongs to an only begotten Son from a Father, and he was full of divine favor and truth. And then John 1, verse 18, no man has seen God at any time. The only begotten God, again, notice small g, who is at the Father's side, is the one who has explained him. Now, you'll notice if you're comparing this to our English translations, or most English translations, especially in John 1, verse 14 and 18, we'll translate those verses as the only Son and as the only God. And the reason why is because the Greek word that's being translated there is a word called monogenes, fun word to remember. So that's the word, monogenes, and it has a range of possible interpretations. It has a range of meanings. And so the New World Translation translates it with the meaning only begotten. And I think just to be fair, it's worth saying that the King James Version, which is probably one of the most widely read translations, also translates verse 14 and 18 with that same translation, only begotten. And the challenge becomes with how you understand that and what that term actually means. From the Jehovah's Witness perspective, they argue that because of the word only begotten, there must have been a time where Jesus Christ did not exist. Right? So they're kind of going off this idea where you say, okay, if somebody is only begotten, then there must have been a time where he was begat. I think that's the right word. There was a time where he was made, right? There was a time where he was conceived. And so the Jehovah's Witnesses hold that Jesus Christ is a created being. They actually argue that he was originally created as the archangel Michael that we read about in Scripture, that he was created before the physical world existed. And they view him, as you can even see in their translation, because they use the small g for God, they view him as, they do view him as a God, but certainly as a lesser God, a much less significant God than God the Father. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses weren't the first ones to have kind of this understanding of that term. I mentioned a few weeks ago the name Arius of Alexandria from the 4th century. And if you read church history, you discover that in the 4th century, probably the biggest controversy centered around what they called Arianism. And one of the major issues in Arianism revolved around this exact word. Arius taught that Jesus was a created being, that he wasn't eternal, that there was a time that he did not exist. And he based his translation and his understanding out of this Greek word, out of this idea of only begotten. So my starting point today is just to wrestle with this understanding. Okay, how do we understand that word? Well, in our tradition, we have a number of doctrinal standards, a number of confessional statements we hold to. One of them is the Heidelberg Catechism, and it asks this question. So I'm just going to read the question answer specifically that deals with this question. It asks, why is he, that is Jesus, why is he called God's only begotten Son, since we also are children of God? And the answer it gives is this: because Christ alone is the eternal, natural Son of God, we, however, are children of God by adoption through grace for Christ's sake. So the Catechism basically explains that word only begotten, it's not meant to describe the origin of Jesus. It's not meant to describe the beginning of Jesus. What it's meant to describe is the unique relationship that exists between God the Son and between God the Father. And so if we're going to engage, for example, in dialogue with groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, then we need to be able to defend, is that actually legitimate? Right? Is our understanding actually faithful to what we're taught in Scripture? And so I'm going to do something a bit different this way. I'm going to walk us kind of through the translation. We're going to deal with three questions. How do we know what the best translation of only begotten is? Or what is the best translation? That's what I want to start with. And then we'll deal with the question of how do we know that? How are we confident in that? And then I want us to kind of bring it back to, okay, why does it actually matter? Is it significant? That's the question where we want to end off. Okay, so what's the best translation? Well, if you look at the screen for a minute, I recognize this is smaller than I had intended, but if you look in the English Standard Version, which is the translation that we use here at church, 9 times in the New Testament you find this particular word, monogenes, translated. 4 times it's translated in the Gospel of John. And in the ESV, every time it's translated with the word only, or in that one case, it's translated as the only Son. That's the consistent translation of the ESV. If we flip to the next screen, you'll see the New International Version. This is another English translation, which I think a lot of you probably also are familiar with. In that translation, 6 of the 9 times, it's translated as the one and only. And I think in this particular case, I actually think that the New International Version is closer to the actual meaning of this word, particularly when it comes to the Gospel of John. Now you might ask, okay, well, how can we be confident that understanding of one and only, how can we be confident that that's a fair translation of the actual text? Well, one of the things that we say when it comes to interpreting the Bible is that we talk about sometimes rules for interpretation. One of the ways that you can interpret a text accurately is to take a passage that is less clear and then to compare it against a passage that's actually just more clear. That's one of the rules of interpretation that we use. And so I want to do that with this particular translation. So if we look at how do we know that this is an accurate translation, the passage I think is helpful here is Hebrews 11, verse 17. Hebrews 11 is this well-known passage, right? Not the best title, but it's called the Heroes of the Faith, right? You have all these names by faith, by faith. And in Hebrews 11, verse 17, it refers specifically to Abraham. And it says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. Now that word for only son in this text is the exact same word that's used in the Gospel of John. It's that word monogenes. The challenge is this, that Isaac wasn't Abraham's only son. Right? If you're familiar with the account of Abraham, then you know that in Genesis 16, he had another son. He had another son first, a son named Ishmael. Ishmael was kind of like, you might say, a surrogate son that was born by way of the servant Hagar. And the author of Hebrews, who spends the entire book basically relating to the Old Testament and unpacking the Old Testament, he was not ignorant of that fact. He was perfectly aware that Abram had another son named Ishmael. So when he describes Isaac with this word as the only son, his point is to say that Isaac was unique, that Isaac was unlike Ishmael in the fact that Isaac was the son that God had promised in Genesis 15. It was Isaac and his family and his descendants who were ultimately going to be the recipient of the covenant promises that God had made to Abraham. And I bring this up because I think this is exactly the point that John is trying to make when it comes to Jesus. John is holding out Jesus as unique. John in John chapter 1 specifically talks about the fact that we can become children of God, but he uses that word to make sure that we understand that Jesus' relationship with the Father is unlike any other. So the question is then, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, I think we have to say that when it comes to the teaching of Arius or the teaching of the Jehovah's Witnesses, their view of Jesus, in some ways the easiest way to put it is that it falls into the category of holding out an Ishmael, whereas the way that the scriptures present Jesus is to hold him out in the terms of the category of Isaac. Jesus is not like an Ishmael. Jesus is not just another one of many created beings. Jesus is entirely unique in terms of his relationship with the Father. Because all of the promises of God ultimately run through Christ. Right? Genesis 3 verse 15 talks about the seed of the woman who is going to come to crush the head of the serpent. Right? That descendant, that son, is not just any creature, it is Jesus Christ, the eternal Son of God. When you think of Genesis 12 and Genesis 17 as well, the descendant through whom all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed, that is being held out as Jesus. Jesus Christ is the unique Son of God in that all of the covenant promises of Scripture, kind of like we talked about this morning, run through him. And so if you want to be an heir to those promises, then you need to belong to the family of God. And what John is saying is this, that the only way that you can belong to the family of God is to be adopted by believing in the name of his only begotten Son. You know, I was reading a book a number of years ago, one of the stories that I think is just so significant when we understand just the implications of Jesus Christ and the adoption that's possible through him. The story was of a man named Timothy Jones, and he described how him and his family had adopted a child, an 8-year-old girl. And this girl had previously been adopted by another family, and she'd been there for a few years, and it hadn't worked out. And so the Jones family had ended up adopting her. And as she spent time with them, they kind of learned a bit more about her story. And in his book, he writes the following. I just share a few quotes. He says, "For one reason or another, whenever our daughter's previous family vacationed at Disney World, they took their biological children with them, but they left their adopted daughter with a family friend. Usually, at least in the child's mind, this happened because she did something wrong that caused her to have to miss the trip. And so by the time we adopted our daughter, she had seen many pictures of Disney World, and she had heard about the rides and the characters and the parades. But when it came to actually passing through the gates of the Magic Kingdom, she had always been the one left on the outside." And so when they heard about this, the Jones family decided, one of the commitments they made was that they were going to take this trip as a family to go to Disney World. And they told their daughter, this 8-year-old daughter, about it, but she really refused to believe it. She began to act out in kind of unusual ways, lashing out, saying things, doing things, because she had become so used to being left on the outside that she was just convinced herself that she wouldn't be allowed to come in the end anyways. And so one night, Jones sits down with his daughter, and she says to him, I know what you're going to do. You're not going to take me to Disney World, are you? And instead of saying, well, we're only going to take you if your behavior improves, he responds and he says, is this trip something we're doing as a family? And the girl said, yes. And he asked her, are you part of this family? And she said, yes. And he said, well, then you're going with us. Now, despite this talk, unfortunately, her behavior did not improve. She continued to be as rebellious as before. And yet they remained faithful to that promise. And eventually the day came where they physically walked through the gates of Disney World. And in the closing part of his book, he describes how just this total change happened in her character. He said she was exhausted and overjoyed and a little weepy at times. This is the evening after. And he said, but her months-long rebellion had faded. When bedtime rolled around, I went up to tuck her in and prayed with her. And then my daughter said, Daddy, I finally got to go to Disney World. But it wasn't because I was good. It was because I'm yours. And I thought about that this week, and I thought, a lot of people, when they think about the Christian faith, they view it through the eyes of that 8-year-old girl. And I think they often feel like they're only going to experience the promises of God if they've been good enough. Or they kind of are burdened by the sense that they kind of need to earn their way into the family of God. And so they're left with that feeling of never having quite done enough. But that's not the gospel that's held out, and that's not the gospel that we confess in the Apostles' Creed. The point of our confession of Jesus Christ and who he is to recognize that there's no way that we ever earn our way into the family of God. The only way is to be adopted into the family of God. And the only way that you're adopted into the family of God is by believing in the name of his only begotten Son. And if you have believed in the name of his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, then you can be confident in the promises of God to you. Not because you're good, but as we just read, because you are his child.